A lot of children's books affect us much more deeply when we read them as adults. And today I want to turn back time, if you will, and look at these books as I initially encountered them as a child in search of their true depth, which I'm now only beginning to appreciate as an adult. We'll work our way backwards, starting with the books of our adolescence and tracing it earlier and earlier to the stories of our earliest memories. In making this list, what really struck me was the further back I went and the simpler the books appeared on the surface, the closer I got to that spark of truth and meaning that I was searching for all along. So here are 9 books that resonate much more deeply as an adult. The first one is really an excellent exploration of memory and moral responsibility. This is actually the first book in a quartet, and it's called The Giver by Lois Lowry. Now, when I read this as a child, it's a dystopian adventure. This boy discovers the truth, classic hero's journey. But as an adult, this becomes a warning against comfort without freedom, or the consequences of pursuing safety without memory. Communities in this story eliminate suffering, but in doing so, they eliminate everything that makes life meaningful. And the story really asks a very interesting question. Is pain merely something we should escape, or is it something we need in order to understand love and beauty and moral responsibility? So this is a book that you definitely want to reread as an adult. Now, another one here we have is a book that explores the chosen and unchosen aspects of growing up and moving beyond childhood. This is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. When I read this as a child, it was this wonderfully evocative and strange adventure story about this boy named Nobody Owens, or Bod. He's raised by ghosts in a graveyard after the murder of his family. And it's obviously a play on The Jungle Book in the title. Now, in this story, the graveyard is mysterious and magical, and occasionally frightening, like the jungle in Kipling's work, but it's also Bod's home. And when we reread this, it's much more bittersweet, I think, because it's not just about the home that Bod lives, it's about the fact that he can't stay there. Eventually he has to leave. The people who raised him, they recognize that he's not of their world. He's not a ghost. He has to go back to the world of the living, which is much more dangerous. And I think when we're children, we have this sense of security and safety that we don't really appreciate until we've grown up and moved beyond it. And the people who raise us, our parents or our guardians or whatnot, they have to make that very difficult decision to prepare us to move beyond where we are and become something more, to grow up, if you will. And I think it's that recognition we have to leave aspects of ourselves behind, including those who raised us, that makes this book so haunting, if you will. The next one is a book about friendship and identity and memory and individuality, really. And this is A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine. Now, I know many people have read and loved this book. When I read this as a child, the aspect that struck me was the cosmic adventure story to the different planets and the supernatural beings. Obviously, the battle against the mysterious darkness is super resonant, and that's something I still think about a lot. But it's really a much deeper and more unsettling story than that, because it's not just about good versus evil battling darkness. It's about the perils of ubiquity, of becoming the same, of eliminating individuality and responsibility for yourself. In this story, overcoming darkness isn't just a generic darkness. It's a perfect darkness. And the main character, Meg, she has to overcome this darkness, and ultimately through her stubbornness and through her flaws. And only then is she able to, by being an individual, a real flawed human individual, defeat the conformist darkness. And I think that's one of the strongest forms of resistance that we really have accessible to us, who we are as individuals. This book really, I think, reminds us that our imperfections are really valuable tools, and they're what makes us more human. So this is another one to reread as an adult. Now, moving further backward in time beyond the adolescent works, there's a story, a bit more of an early reader story about cleverness, another one about individuality and being yourself, using your gifts. And this is Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl. Now, this is fun, fast, funny adventure, exceptionally clever. Fox is obviously the core character, the protagonist. He's outwitting these horrible farmers And Mr. Fox, he's a charming and fun guy who's always got another plan, right? Just like all of Dahl's books, it's very fun. But when you read this as an adult, you also see that there's a real wisdom there as well. Mr. Fox's pride and appetite places himself and his family and his community in danger many times. And so the decisions he makes really have consequences. But he also grows and he's able to take responsibility eventually. And so when a battle begins and the farmers kind of, I don't want to spoil anything in the story, but when the story expands, the greatest achievement of Mr. Fox is that he moves beyond selfishness of just being himself and doing everything he does for his community. So I think as an adult, we read this and realize that it's like our talents for life. We use them for our own advancement, but as we grow and as we create relationships, we also create responsibilities for the people who depend on us. So this is a really wonderful book to reread. Next, we have a book about the fantasy of never growing up, which is obviously something we have to explore when we're looking at these books about childhood. And this is Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie, one of my personal favorites. I've spoken about this many times before, but when you read this as a child, you're obviously lost in Neverland. It's a great escape. There's pirates and fairies and mermaids and everything you could want as a child. No parents, no teachers, no school, right? But there's no responsibility here. And so Peter Pan at first seems completely free when you're reading him as a kid. You're like, everyone wants to be Peter Pan. But when you read this book as an adult, you realize he's the tragic character in the story, right? It's that refusal to grow up that means that nothing can change. He can't grow. He can't sustain relationships. He can't really recognize the pain that he causes in others around him. And he forgets that the people who matter to him, the people who were most important to him, they're their own people, right? He literally just forgets about them a lot of times. So Wendy gets the ability to grow up and build a life, but Peter, he retains his childhood at the cost of his potential of ever becoming anything more than he already is, which is just a kid. And this book acknowledges like growing up, yes, it involves genuine loss, but also that growth is essential, and a refusal to grow is an even greater loss. Wonderful book. Next, this is one I know a lot of people are saying this is going to have to be mentioned. A story about friendship, a story about words, ultimately, and helping another person recognize their own value. And that's Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Now, reading this as a kid, it's obviously the story about a pig and a spider and, saving his life and helping him, but it's really more meaningful when you read this as an adult. And I should also mention that E.B. White, great writer, one of my favorites, The Trumpet and the Swan, Stuart Little, he's got a lot of other ones that are just absolutely worth reading, but this one in particular hits different, I think, when you're an adult. Charlotte uses her intelligence and the remaining time available to her to persuade the world that Wilbur's worth saving. And that's just something that's so beautiful, right? I think that this book introduces a lot of young readers to mortality, but the idea that Charlotte can't remain forever with Wilbur and that her life is going to have to end eventually and that things are going to have to go on, like that's a beautiful concept. But when we read this as adults, we really understand that it's more than that. It's the love that matters, right? Because you have a limited amount of time and you have to seek meaning and spend that time together with those that you love. And Charlotte's Web really just reminds us that that's one aspect. And the other aspect is helping others to see the goodness in them is one of the most meaningful things you can do. Beautiful book. Definitely worth rereading. Now, moving even further back, we go to the era of wisdom and childhood and foolishness of adults. This is like right at the very beginning. You read this when you're very young. The first one I have is The Little Prince. This is a fun story, of course, about this prince who's traveling to different planets. He's meeting a collection of these crazy, weird adults that are all obsessed with just useless, unimportant things. And it's really kind of a painful depiction, I think, a lot of when we read this as adults, of how grown-ups can be really obsessed with things like status and money and ownership and authority and things that ultimately don't really matter. And seeing it through the eyes of a child, you just recognize the foolishness of a lot of aspects of this. The Little Prince, he really understands that love creates responsibility, right? His rose is one of the themes of the book, is the thing that really matters to him. And there's this gut-wrenching scene where he sees thousands of roses like her, but he says, it doesn't matter because that's my rose. That's the difference. And I think as adults, we often search for meaning in scale or achievement or recognition, and grass is greener on this side. We're looking for other things, but this book reminds us of a simple truth. It's the relationships we tend and the beauty we notice and we actually take action on and live our lives based off of that creates meaning. And it's the same with love. So this is a book absolutely worth rereading as an adult. Next, we have a book that is rooted in Jewish folklore, and this is a story about family and inheritance and creativity. It's called Something from Nothing by Phoebe Gilman. This is a great book. I've spoken about this before, I believe, but when I read this as a child, I remember my grandparents and my parents reading this to me, so it's very nostalgic. It's about this beautiful blanket that the grandfather makes for his grandson, Joseph. And basically, this grandfather repeatedly transforms this blanket into something new when it gets ripped. So it becomes a jacket, and then a vest, and then a tie, and then a handkerchief, and then finally smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's about the way that love and memory survive all these iterations and transformations and changes, because nothing material lasts in life. And everything eventually becomes smaller. What we retain, the memories we retain of people, even. You could see it as a metaphor for that, but also of physical objects. And in the story, Joseph realizes that there's always going to be enough material for a story. That's the smallest unit, I suppose, that we have, what remains at the end of the day. We inherit objects and traditions and memories and stories and fragments of the people that came before us and our family. And we, as much as we try, we just can't preserve every aspect of that. But we can continue transforming it. We can keep whatever we can maintain and turn it into something meaningful again and again to create something from nothing. So, beautiful story. And finally, we return to one of the most core stories of childhood, at least for myself, the great books about love and loss and what it means to become real. And this is The Velveteen Rabbit by Margery. Now, I don't have my physical copy here. I think I had it in my parents' house, but as a child, this is a story about a toy, right? Who desperately wants to become real. I think that when you read this as an adult, though, what you really understand is that transformation has a cost. It's not painless. The rabbit becomes shabby in the story. The fur is rubbed away, loses the pristine appearance of when he was new. But that wear is not evidence that the value is lost. If anything, it's just evidence that there's love. So we read this as a kid and we imagine, there's this kind of magical reward element to it. But I think when we read this as an adult, we really understand that it's just love leaves marks and time changes us. I actually don't think this book was even written for children. This must have been written for adults, because you read this as an adult, you're like, this is completely different. The goal is not to pass through life untouched, right? It's to become something real through the experiences and the challenges of love. So I think it's one of the greatest books ever written. Call me sentimental if you will, but I always maintain that nostalgia is a very powerful force. Perhaps this is why a lot of these children's books, or generally overly sentimental books, kind of resonate with me sometimes more than they do with the average person. And perhaps this is why these books hit so much harder when we return to them as adults. I don't think we return to the work of children's literature because we want to return to childhood per se. I think the real reason we want to reread these stories is because we've learned so much and we've come so far, and we're not going to simply return, but many of us feel that we've lost touch with several, I think, important, essential truths that were easily accessible to us when we were children. And we're still searching for that strange wisdom that adulthood has somehow convinced us to ignore. These books remind us of that simple but important truth that there are things like memory and growth and love that really matter, but, becoming real, as it were, means that life changes us. And so we're not going to be the same. And so that's really, I think, why we go back in time. And that's why we read these stories. So if any of this resonated with you, I encourage you to take a look at some of these books. Go rediscover that spark of genius that existed inside of you before you learned to become an adult and to call yourself sensible. Take care.